Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this exciting staging of the Emerging Directions in Black Studies series organized by doctoral candidate in the Graduate School of Education and African American Studies graduate fellow, Darion Wallace. My name is Dr. Katie Dieter, and I'm the Director of Advanced Studies and Community Engaged Learning in the newly formed Department of African American Studies at Stanford University. I am truly honored and excited to hear from these emerging scholars who share a deep commitment to exploring the multifaceted and dynamic field of Black studies. It is essential to acknowledge the profound impact that Black studies has had on academia. From its inception, this field has challenged traditional narratives and social hierarchies, diversified the academy, and reshaped our perspectives on race and identity, ultimately being in service to improving Black life and continuing a deep commitment to the pursuit of Black liberation and the liberation of all marginalized people. Today, we gather not only to celebrate its rich history, but also to explore the emerging directions that will shape the future of the field of Black studies. Before we dive into the future, I want to briefly reflect on the historical roots of Black studies. Born out of civil rights and Black liberation movements in both the US and in certain countries in Africa and the Caribbean, along with a desire for a more inclusive education, Black studies emerged as a direct response to the systemic erasure of Black experiences, histories, and cultures from mainstream curricula. African American Studies at Stanford is celebrating our 55th year this year. And just like other Black studies programs and departments, our history began through student protests when members of the Stanford's Black Student Union took the mic from the provost at an all-white male panel at a university-wide convocation. These students demanded the urgent need to transform higher education by addressing historical omissions and developing a field for scholarly exploration that centers Black experiences, histories, cultures, challenges social hierarchies, and diversifies the academy. So fast forward to today, and we see a field that has evolved dynamically, adapting to the changing landscape of academia, technology, and globalization. The themes and methodologies explored in Black studies have expanded to encompass a wide array of disciplines, which is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the field, demonstrating its continued relevance in addressing contemporary challenges. So now let's turn our attention to the exciting prospects lying ahead in the realm of Black studies. The emerging directions we will explore today are crucial in fostering a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the Black experience. The doctoral students participating in this panel today explore research topics from navigating academic support for Black West Indian girls in high schools, presented by Khrysta A, Civil Rights, Apollo 11, and the Future of Black Study, presented by Adriana Green, Island Feeling Across Time and Space, presented by Alyssa James, and the Anti-Blackness of Black Religion's Anti-Death Orientation, presented by Rebecca Wilcox. As we embark on this exploration of emerging directions in Black studies, it's essential to emphasize the importance of this collaboration. The panelists today are doctoral students from 4 different universities, which will be introduced to us shortly. By fostering these interdisciplinary collaborations across universities, we can ensure a more holistic and comprehensive understanding of the evolving narratives within Black studies. So I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the 2nd annual Emerging Directions in Black Studies panel as we close out this year's Black History Month, or Black Liberation Month, as we like to call it here at Stanford. I encourage each of you to engage deeply, to ask questions, and to contribute your unique perspectives to our collective understandings. In many ways, these emerging scholars can be seen as the heartbeat of the field of Black studies, helping us to forge a path toward a more informed and liberated future. So now I will pass the mic to Darion Wallace. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Dieter, for welcoming us to the space and kind of framing what Black studies and its tradition has been here at Stanford. And as she said, my name is Darion Wallace. I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and I study the history of Black abolitionist teachers in the American West. I have the honor and privilege of serving as a graduate fellow here in the AAAS department, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our 2nd annual Emerging Directions panel. Today, we have 4 brilliant emerging scholars in Black studies. They'll share their work with us and discuss the future of the discipline. Convening this space today is a continuation of a long legacy of Black studies at Stanford that's been built by scholars like St. Clair Drake, Bell Hooks, Cedric Robinson, Moira Latson Billings, and Sylvia Winter, whose scholarship has shaped the field in unparalleled ways. More than doing the important work of just indexing Black life, history, and culture, we as scholars of Black studies here at Stanford recognize that we're inheriting a legacy of an intellectual tradition that rigorously unsettles Western regimes of truth and liberal humanism to reconfigure the world anew with infinite possibilities of otherwise lives. With this in mind, this space today, the Emerging Direction panel, is of particular importance to engage young scholars who are continuing this tradition. So once again, thank you all for joining us and enjoy the presentations. As you all hear them, please feel to add your questions to the Q&A queue, and we'll make sure that we address those during the Q&A section. And so at this point, I want to invite Aaliyah to the stage to introduce our first presenter.
Thank you, Darion. Thank you, Katie. Beautiful Black people, great to be here. Thank you for all the scholars. My name is Aaliyah Dunn Salahuddin. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department, focusing on civil rights, race, and environment and infrastructure in Northern California and the San Francisco Bay Area. I have the honor and privilege of introducing Khrysta A. Evans, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in educational policy studies in the social sciences concentration with a minor in gender and women's studies. Originally from the Bronx, New York, she earned her BA in sociology from the University of Maryland and her MA in educational studies from the University of Michigan. Before coming back to the academy for her PhD, Khrysta spent several years working in student support roles in schools and nonprofit organizations. As a scholar, Khrysta is excited to learn about Black girls' knowledge production and placemaking within schools, a work that I had the pleasure of seeing at the conference as well at UC Berkeley. Situated in sociology of education, Black studies, gender and women's studies, and cultural geography, Khrysta's teaching, research, and mentoring are all concerned with how race, gender, and place shape students' educational experiences with specific attention to how Black girls develop and employ spatial strategies and social networks to navigate their schools. Let's give Khrysta, soon to be Dr. Evans, a warm welcome, and feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you so much for that intro. I'm just going to hide everyone for a second. I'm so grateful. Thank you all so much for coming out today. As was said before, my name is Khrysta A. Evans, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm really excited to share this work that I have. Just some brief background on the project. So in one of my first interviews for this project, I asked Zoe, who is a vibrant 12th grader in search of loyalty and peace, if she liked her school. She, in fact, hated her school, but she said, I know how to maneuver myself. I know who to fuck with and who not to just by reading the room. Now, drawing from Zoe's brilliance and also thinking along the lines of Saidiya Hartman's idea of the wayward, this talk is titled Wayward Maneuvers, Black West Indian Girls Navigating Academic Support in New York City High School. And here I'm going to talk about some of the maneuvers that the girls in my study do in response to the critiques that they have of their schools. So I'll start with Lily's maneuver. So Lily is an 11th grade girl at what I'm calling Blue Ridge, and all the names I should have said are pseudonyms, at Blue Ridge High School, which is one of the high schools in my study. Now, she is a student who is very honest about her academic struggles, but yet she shows up to her classes every day with her edges laid and her patent leather telephone in hand. And when I asked her if she likes school, Lily says this, right? She says, I feel like the school has unrealistic expectations of their students or for the sense of how they teach. I feel like you can't expect the students to have 90% average every chance when work is barely being given out. Even when work is being given out, it's not necessarily being explained in the way it needs to be. Only like a handful of teachers teach to my liking. And so when we look at what Lily says here, she and many of the other girls in the study, the critiques they have, right? So Lily's talking about you're not teaching enough, you aren't giving us enough work, you're not explaining the work, only a few of you are teaching to my liking. These critiques really shapes the way that she navigates space in schools. To show how, I'm just gonna turn to January 10th at Blue Ridge. And on this Wednesday, I waited so hard for the fourth period bell to ring because I was so eager to get to Miss Campbell's 11th grade English class. Now, Miss Campbell is what we would call a proper Jamaican woman. She always has her hair in a tight bun. She always wears skirts, never pants, and she always has on stockings, right? But this mix of sarcasm and high demands of quality work that she has leads students to always and constantly name her as a source of academic support. So when I got to her class, students are piling in, and in walks Lily. And Lily walks in and she's like, can I come in? No other student had asked, but she did. She came in, she walked in, she grabs stuff out of her Easy, and she sits down. Other students are walking in, and then Miss Campbell stops and she says, how many of you all are not supposed to be here? Several hands raised, including Lily, right? And Miss Campbell says, you know what? You're gonna be here, you're gonna work. And work is what Lily did. She spent the time writing notes furiously. She was raising her hand to answer questions. And this is just so different from what I've seen with other classes. She had her AirPods in and she's kind of trying to inconspicuously scroll on the phone, right? But as the class is wrapping up, I run over to Lily and I'm like, Lily, what class you got right now? Matter of factly, she responds, US history, but I like Miss Campbell class better. And so cutting class, not new, right? I'm not going to ask how many of you all did it, but this maneuver that Lily does really highlights how her navigation of the school space is linked to the critiques of the school, right? She said she doesn't like how a lot of people teach, right? And so what she does is she makes way for herself to still get the education that she deserves. So instead of going to one class where she knows the quality is not great, she's going to another one. And so in this presentation today, I'm going to think through Lily and other Black West Indian girls' maneuvers in school. And so while this project is a larger project, what I'm going to focus on today, this research question for today, is what spatial practices and support networks do Black West Indian girls attending 2 New York City public high schools develop in the navigations of schools? And so to address these questions, here's the bodies of literature that I draw from, right? And so using the Black Studies lens to read the literature, it's very clear that schools are a social institution where anti-Blackness is embedded and integrated into the policies and the curriculum, right? But to understand how schools organize the landscape that students and staff are traversing, I also included organizational routines, which allow me to look at the repetitive and recognizable patterns of interdependent actions involving multiple actors. So within my study, I look at routines around testing, discipline, scheduling to see how schools are trying to organize themselves and then in turn attempting to organize students. And to help me think through this data, I'm developing what I'm calling the Geographies of Black Girls Living framework. And so this framework draws on Black geographies, Black studies, Black girlhood studies to really think about schools as both plantations as plots, similar to Sylvia Wynter, right? And within these plantations and plots, we thinking about how ordinary Black girls engage in placemaking as they develop spatial maneuvers to engage in what Hartman would call this beautiful experiment of living. Right, using this framework, I'm particularly interested in the spatial strategies that they implement to refuse the ways that their schools have rendered them as always needing to be disciplined or uninterested in learning. And so to think about the research design, the larger project is a multi-site ethnography, which allows me to collect data across 2 schools. I'm also using Black feminism and place-based inquiry as well. And so my research setting, this work is taking place in a New York City neighborhood that I'm calling Marksville. Marksville is a completely West Indian enclave in New York City. And so by looking at these 2 public schools, both Valley and Blue Ridge, these 2 schools exist in one building, they both house predominantly Black and Latinx students, right? But pulling from the neighborhood, a lot of the Black students are immigrants themselves or first-generation Americans, mostly from the Caribbean. And so looking at my data that I'm collecting over the course of 10 months, for this, what we're looking at today, the primary participants are Black West Indian girls, about 15 of them across both schools. And then for today's data, it's coming from when Black girls are participating, I'm doing ethnographic observations. They're also participating in a sort of 3 interviews with me, so social network analysis, walk-in interviews, and focus groups. And then also for the data analysis, a lot of in-process memos, again, going back to that framework to think about how these girls are talking about space. And then because social network analysis has some quantitative aspects to it, I am doing some descriptive statistics using R. And so here's a look of the girls that are in my study thus far. We have 13 thus far. And so there are 6 at Valley High School up here, and then 7 in Blue Ridge High School, right? And across both schools, 8 of them were born in the Caribbean, and 5 are of Caribbean descent, but born outside of the Caribbean. Right, and so now I'm going to shift to talk about maneuvering as one of my findings. And so while I have these 3 themes, for the purpose of time, I'm only going to stick to this 3rd one, which is maneuvering academic support. And so what I found here is that while both Blue Ridge and Valley have implemented organizational routines that are aimed to enrich and support students' academic learning, the girls in my study are not always reaching for these school-sanctioned academic supports, and instead of maneuvering by claiming their own spaces for the academic support that they need. And so one example of this is advisory, right? And so in my initial interviews with principals, they talked about pouring a lot of school resources into building up the advisory program, right? Now, these are supposed to be places where students are receiving academic support, social and emotional support, right? And they're structured so that students attend them multiple times a week in period blocks of 45 minutes. And so you would expect that students would be looking for these spaces. But in my social network analysis interviews, when I asked them, where are the spaces that you're going to for these different types of support, these are the spaces that they mentioned. And you'll see a lot of different spaces here, but what you won't see is advisory. And so I got the chance to ask students, advisory is supposed to be this big thing at your both schools. Why isn't advisory here? And Sable explains it, right? She says, I don't want to go to advisory. I go to the staircase for that, right? In advisory, it's like I'm staring at the walls, or I'm staring at the smartboard. We don't do nothing in advisory. So again, that critique of we don't do nothing, and so I'm going elsewhere, right? And it's really interesting that she and other places, other students mention going to the staircase, because you would typically think of the staircase not as a space where students are organizing for support, but as a space that we might even call wayward themselves, right? But also thinking about that as a maneuver. And so now I also want to think about Tay's maneuver. And Tay is an 11th grade student who is super frustrated at how her teachers often ignore her, right? And when I asked, what is the support that you're getting from your support network, academic support you're getting from your network, she talked about this story, right? One day I needed help with algebra because sometimes the teacher just puts the sheets in front of your face and you got to pretend you know everything. So I went to Miss Asia to get help because she was posted right in front of my class and she helped me, right? And so what you should know about this is that Miss Asia is not a math teacher. Miss Asia is not a teacher at all. Miss Asia is a school aide, right? And so for those of you who have been in public schools, school aides are the folks that are posted in the hallway. They have a chair in the hallway, and their job is to direct traffic, make sure that students are not lingering or cutting class, right? And so Tay's maneuver at this point, because she is frustrated at the fact that her math teacher would not help her, is to go outside and get help from someone else, right? She leaves the classroom to get the help that she should be receiving in there. And so when I asked her, like, did you get permission? How did you get to go talk to Miss Asia? Right? She simply says, I took my sheet of paper. I said, I need to go to the bathroom. And I went. The teacher even came out there and saw me, and I waved, and I went back to her helping me, right? So again, this refusal to remain in spaces where you're not getting the support is part of Tay's maneuver, right? And when I asked, like, did he say anything to you about it? It's like, no. And to be honest, I wouldn't care too much because you're not teaching, you're sitting down here, you're just talking. She goes on to say, your whole lesson cannot be based off of paper, referencing a sheet of paper that she and many other students get. You got to bring your outside sources, inside sources, roundabout sources. You have to bring all of that. So I got help from somebody else, right? And so when we look at what Tay is doing, right, it's so easy to then focus on like, oh, these students are cutting class, they're leaving class, but actually they're providing really important insight and critiques on where the schools need to improve. And so in thinking about all of these maneuvers that I've discussed today, from Zoe to Lily to Sable to Tay, right, we can see that whether students are skipping class or leaving class, these things can be easily punished, and they typically are. But when we take a second to understand these maneuvers beyond the violation of school rules, we see how these girls are engaging in wayward acts to demand their right to learn, right? So when we decenter the harm that they face in schools and instead center their wayward maneuvers, we unveil not only the agency they enact, but also the critiques they have of the institutions. And so thank you all so much. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
All right. Hello, everybody. I tried to turn on my video, but it didn't work. So can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So I am really excited to introduce a very special thinker and writer in Black studies, Adriana Green. Adriana Green is a cross-genre writer from Southern Virginia with a love of all things otherworldly. Currently, she is a doctoral candidate in UC Berkeley's African American and African Diaspora Studies Department, where she engages archival research, literary critique, and Black feminist theory. Adriana's dissertation is a meditation on the dispersal of Black people, not only across faith, but also across time during the long years and leading up. Most recently, she began a short-term research fellowship at the Huntington Library to explore Octavia E. Butler's archive. We're so excited to hear from you, Adriana.
Thank you, Umnia. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. And thank you, Darion, for organizing, and thank you, Dr. Robinson, for being a part of our Q&A today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And I'm going to hide all of you because it makes me nervous to see your faces. Okay.
Hey, I think we briefly saw the share screen. I don't know that it's showing right now.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Sorry about that. Is it shared now?
Yes, there's a YouTube
Yes.
clip showing. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. On July 15th, 1969, a silver bus drove onto the grass near Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. TV cameras recorded eager families gathered in anticipation of a historic event, the launch of Apollo 11. What wasn't shown on many newsreels of the time was the procession of civil rights activists marching amidst the sightseeing families. In the little scene footage, blonde-haired women and blue-eyed boys nervously shift their Kodaks and turn away from the launch pad to stare at the all-Black crowd stepping out of the bus. Squinting in the Florida sun, the protesters sang hymns and gathered together, raising signs with handwritten messages like "Billions for Space," "Pennies for the Hungry," and "America, your mind is in orbit, re-enter humanity." There we go. This group of protesters was led by SCLC executive and Poor People's Campaign organizer, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. In the grainy footage, we watch as Abernathy explains to the journalists, "I'm here to demonstrate in a symbolic way the tragic and inexcusable gulf between America's technological capabilities and our social injustice." What Abernathy termed a technological gulf, we in Black Studies today might understand as the afterlife of slavery, a reality in which, quote, "Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that was entrenched centuries ago," which includes skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. Leading the march on July 15th were a pair of mules pulling a wagon. This juxtaposition, intentionally or not, calls to mind Sherman's Special Field Order, commonly known as 40 Acres and a Mule, which promised but never delivered settlement and ownership of a large portion of the Sea Islands of South Carolina to the formerly enslaved. This juxtaposition between the bony mules and the towering Saturn V rocket offers a stark visual representation of the technological gulf in the afterlife of slavery. In one image, tying together the advances of the space race to the history of unpaid labor and wage exploitation of chattel slavery in the US. Here we see America jetting into the future with unpaid debts, and in this context, the protest of the Apollo 11 launch can be considered a call for reparations. My opening chapter, Never Mind the Moon, Civil Rights, Apollo 11, and the Future of Black Study, features a critical analysis of this intersection of Black activism in the 1960s and the space race as a way to better understand the history of futurity in the US. Travel to outer space broadly, and the surface of the moon in particular, have been culturally coded as the landscape of the future. The belief that there is only one future and it belongs to the US has been a key component of statecraft for this country. One of the primary arguments for the expansion of the US influence westward, from East Coast to the West, from sea to shining sea, was the 1839 assertion of manifest destiny, or the idea that, quote, "we may confidently assume that our country is destined to be the great nation of futurity." The federal government couldn't claim first rights to the land, but by projecting what historian Michel Rolfe-Trio calls a linear and cumulative sense of time that neatly separates the past and the future into distinct entities, the US claimed last rights to the land. By declaring the future as predetermined and already divinely owned, the US territorialized it as a kind of private property that ostensibly came with the moral authority to discipline, enclose, and evict. In 1969, the frontiers of the West had been extended to space, and the federal government believed that laying claim to the final frontier of outer space was key to securing US political power. Through narratives around space travel, in particular the moon landing, we can see the evolution of manifest destiny into a more contemporary version of the territorialization of the future. In her 2019 monograph, Race After Technology, sociologist Ruha Benjamin provides an example of one of the core underlying tenets of progress that we contend with today: the unquestioned belief that certain technological advancements are inevitable, from genetic modifications to weapons building to social media algorithms to outer space travel. Such developments are, quote, are inevitable. Sorry, let me say that again. Critiques of high-risk technologies are often countered with the argument that such developments are inevitable, the engine of human progress, and that to slow the engine of progress would mean falling behind in the global race of technological supremacy. This assumption relies on the idea of linear progressive time, that time is destined to travel in one direction, that set evolutions will take place, and that by being ahead on that timeline, the US can anticipate and thus capitalize on the inevitable future. The shared themes in Manifest Destiny and the space race are key tenets of what I mean when I say we can study this history of futurity in the US. Historically, assumptions about the future, about time and how it is supposed to progress, have been used to pressure and displace and exploit bodies and to hoard resources and political power. Whether depicted in 1839 or 1969, the future in the US political imaginary has historically been mythologized as an inevitable progression of techno-capitalism brought about via the discovery of new worlds, the privatization of property, resource extraction, and labor exploitation. Owning and managing the future continues to be a foundational priority for the US, or as the 45th president said a few years ago when we launched our intersolar branch of the military, Space Force, quote, "Our nation of pioneers still yearns to conquer the unknown because we are Americans and the future belongs totally to us." My dissertation project, Geographies of the Future, Space, Time, and Race in the US Political Imaginary, traces this territorialization of the future as a part of US nation building, and also analyzes what this has meant for Black radical thought, past and present. In my dissertation, I close-read art objects, such as Nigerian-British artist Inka Shonibare's Refugee Astronaut series, which he describes as being, quote, "the reverse of the colonial instinct of the astronaut." Here we see a nomadic astronaut trying to find somewhere, anywhere, that is still habitable. I also look at the artwork of acclaimed artist Alicia B. Wormsley, whose work addresses, quote, "addresses systemic oppression of Black communities through space and time by reassuring the presence of Black bodies in the future." I'm currently conducting archival research at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, where Octavia Butler bestowed her extensive archives. An entire chapter of my dissertation is dedicated to her because she is uniquely suited for thinking through a seemingly foreclosed future. In my work, I will also trace the figure of Columbus in the political imaginary and analyze Western time itself, outlining the history of Greenwich Mean Time and how it has been used as a colonial technology, past and present. This framework has implications for aesthetic traditions like Afrofuturism and for the temporal critique that underlines Afropessimism. It also holds contemporary relevance in conversations around reparations and current NASA projects like Project Artemis, which features a main goal to land the first woman and first person of color on the moon. Viewing Project Artemis through the framework of critical futurity begs the question, what would it look like if, rather than simply including Black and brown faces in the geography of the future, we demand that federal projects of futurity be accountable to the continued afterlife of slavery? For example, rather than reverse engineering space technology for use in inner cities, which was a NASA initiative that failed from the 1970s, what if NASA, Space Force, and federally contracted companies like SpaceX were required to first focus on developing technologies for clean air and water here on Earth, and then reverse engineer them for space travel, rather than vice versa? I start my project with this intersection of the modern civil rights movement and the space race because it offers a familiar history and grounding for complex theories about time and space. My chapter title, Never Mind the Moon, is a quote from a news clip taken at the Harlem Cultural Festival the same day that man landed on the moon. When asked how he felt about the technological feat, one interviewee said, "The cash they wasted in getting to the moon could have been used for poor people, poor Black people in Harlem and all over the place." Oh, I can't see the full quote, my apologies. And all over the place, all over this country. So, never mind the moon. Let's get some of that cash here in Harlem. In the context of my work, Never Mind the Moon is a call for us to separate technological advancements from Western progress narratives and understand things like space travel as aesthetics of futurity rather than the actual future. Never Mind the Moon is a call to see space travel not as an advancement or a shift away from our present moment, but rather a continuation of our shared colonial past. Back in 1969, on the eve of the space launch, Reverend Ralph Abernathy was eventually greeted by the head of NASA, Thomas Paine, who said that the great technological advances of NASA were child's play compared to the tremendously difficult human problems with which Abernathy and his people were concerned. He then jokingly offered to hitch our rocket to your wagon, before insisting if it were possible for us tomorrow morning not to push the button and to instead solve the problems with which you are concerned, believe me, we would not push the button. But of course, Thomas Paine had it the wrong way around. The rocket has been hitched to the wagon, because for centuries, US technological feats have been made possible by the dispossession of land and exploitation of bodies, which created the national wealth, which funded man's daring trip to the moon. The next morning, at 1332 hours Coordinated Universal Time, which is Greenwich Mean Time, because the time of England is the time of the universe, which I have a bone to pick about. At 9:30 the next day, Eastern Standard Time, the button was pushed and Apollo 11 sent on its way. Hours later, Neil Armstrong would set foot on the moon, and back in Florida, business continued as usual. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. That was really brilliant and thought-provoking, and I learned a lot. I'm looking forward to reading more of your work in the future. My name is Carmen Irvin. I am a PhD student in anthropology. I'm broadly interested in the erasures and recoveries of Black life in France's so-called overseas territories in the Indian Ocean world, La Réunion and Mayotte. And so today I am grateful to have the honor of introducing a brilliant PhD candidate and scholar who's working in a similar region in the Caribbean. And I will, without further ado, Alyssa James is a first-generation Jamaican-Canadian scholar and writer from Toronto, Canada. She received her Honors Bachelor of Science with distinction in Psychology and Equity Studies from the University of Toronto and a Master's in Social Anthropology from York University. She is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University, where she studies how discourses of possibility shape the nascent coffee industry in Martinique and shed light on Caribbean futures. Her scholarship receives generous support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Wintergrand Foundation. She was co-host of Zara's Daughters podcast, a wonderful Black feminist anthropological take on popular culture and issues that concern Black women, which received a Society of Fellows and Heyman Center Public Humanities Graduate Fellowship in 2022. She is the recipient of the 2023 Setha M. Lowe Engaged Anthropology Award from the American Anthropological Association. And Alyssa, I will pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Carmen. And I love meeting people who are also working in the French Caribbean, where we are a very small group, especially in anthropology. So today I will be talking to you about volcanoes, and I have a little explanation as to why I'm talking about volcanoes when my research is about coffee. So without further ado, my dissertation, Vexed Temporality, Coffee Pass, and Martinican Futurities, is a historical and political ethnography of a cultural heritage and economic development project in Martinique. In my research, I examined a local heritage project designed to revive the island's historic coffee industry. Thus, I take coffee as my object of observation. However, my object of study is the whole world of coffee, temporality, and Caribbean identity. Even as they emerge from ruptures of history, geography, and place, Black Atlantic identities are deeply entangled with those things. My talk today emerges from the ways Martinicans connect their rich agricultural heritage to the fertile volcanic soil and simultaneously connect the volcano to what it means to be Caribbean. Volcanic soils contribute to the possibility for a successful coffee industry, an industry that hinges on differentiation. Yet the islands as volcanic geological formations allow for social relations through historical and affective connections. I explore this latter dynamic in my work, a tectonic imaginary that rejects Flag nationalism and helps to shift common sense understandings of Caribbean islands as separated by the sea, by language, and by imperial zones. Rather than working with the tectonic as vulnerability to disaster, as in the 2010s post-earthquake work on Haiti, I consider the volcano and its seismic activity as one that produces alternative possibilities, the potential for connection, revolution, and transformation. This is the little explanation of where I work. Lesser Antilles, St. Vincent is just south, and some of these sites, St. Marie or St. Pierre La Trinité, are some of the sites that I'll be talking about. In Martinique, there is a popular belief that the island's volcano, Mount Pelée, and St. Vincent's volcano, La Soufrière, share magmatic storage reservoirs. Why? In 1902, just a day after La Soufrière erupted, Mount Pelée did too, leveling St. Pierre and killing 30,000 people within minutes. This death toll makes the eruption the third deadliest in history and likely the most efficient. While many more perished in 19th century volcanic eruptions in Indonesia, many of the victims died from secondary effects like illness, starvation, and a tsunami triggered by the eruption. So despite scientists' assertion that there is no connection between Caribbean volcanoes, the belief has prevailed. Scientific evidence did little to quell concerns when both volcanoes simultaneously showed signs of increased activity in December 2020, and then La Soufrière erupted in April 2021. For Martinicans, this activity and eruption is a harbinger of the catastrophe that is to come, regardless of scientific evidence to the contrary. In response to that increasing seismic and volcanic activity on Mount Pelée in Martinique, local officials raised the threat level to Vigilance Jaune, or yellow alert, the third level on a scale of 5. On April 9th, 2021, La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines saw an increase in eruptive activity that triggered pyroclastic flows. And this picture is what a pyroclastic flow looks like. They're dangerous and fast-moving avalanches of hot ash and gas of the kind that made Mount Pelée famous. The eruption blanketed the island with ash and debris, contaminating agricultural fields and water supplies. After the eruption of La Soufrière in St. Vincent, I noticed a marked increase in the publication of volcanic activity monitoring data in the local newspaper, despite state efforts to reassure Martinicans there was no imminent danger. This paper analyzes the tectonic relationality that connects Martinique with other islands in the Caribbean, despite continental epistemologies and geopolitical statuses that construct the island as separate, exceptional, and privileged. As an overseas department of France, Martinique is geographically and socio-historically Caribbean, but politically European, and has access to resources that independent and even some non-sovereign Caribbean islands do not. While assimilationists support and independentists lament this regional exceptionalism, I argue that these tectonic connections produce archipelagic feelings of relation that lie beneath the surface of Martinican understandings of their place in the world. Rather than looking at the way Martinican identity requires the negotiation of markers of difference, I consider how social and ecological history and the environmental present allow Martinicans to transcend territorial and political boundaries to feel their way into relation with other islands in the Caribbean. This paper comes out of a chapter of my dissertation where I examine the futurity of threat and anticipation through a discourse analysis of the weekly publication of a tally of the number of earthquakes beneath Mount Pelée in the newspaper of record. As Brian Masumi observes, we live in times when what has not happened qualifies as front page news. Threat, temporally nonlinear, becomes the new normal and demonstrates how that which is not material can be felt into being. Through that chapter and this paper, I wanted to think with something other than the hurricane, which has become the Caribbean disaster event par excellence. Here, the volcano is materially and affectively a product of these tectonic connections, carrying with it the possibility of alternative futures and the potential for revolution and transformation. In relation to France, Martinique has long been constructed as exceptional. Despite France's founding principle of Republican universalism, the ideal that the collective transcends individual differences like culture, history, ethnicity, religion, race, of course, and for a long time, geography. In Paradise Destroyed, Catastrophe and Citizenship in the French Caribbean, historian Christopher Church demonstrates how disaster events precipitated civil unrest that prompted a calculus of disaster that justified civic disparity. Just a year after the 1902 eruption, a major hurricane hit Martinique, killing hundreds and destroying that year's sugar crop. This time, disaster fatigue stymied French assistance for recovery efforts, and French officials manufactured a calculus of disaster to exculpate themselves from aiding the island, blaming islanders' over-reliance on sugar for their woes, rather than admitting that French imperial policy had created the island's monoculture in the first place. In an effort to enforce universalism, the French state ignored the specificities of Martinique and Guadeloupe, applying laws and building infrastructure that undermined the island's development and access to assistance, thus marking French Antillians as distinct, which is the opposite of republicanism, or universalism, by their tropical environment. This reflects Catherine McKittrick's observation that geography is used to render Black people as deserving of death by their ability to live in the uninhabitable. In relation to much of the Caribbean, Martinique is also constructed as exceptional. While the island shares a legacy of European colonialism and chattel slavery with other states and territories in the region, efforts led by Aimé Césaire in the 1940s led to an unusual transformation of its colonial status. In 1946, along with the other so-called old colonies, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and Reunion Island, Martinique became a department of France, making its residents French citizens. Eschewing independence in favor of complete integration, what is called assimilation or assimilation, this decision shaped the politics and future of the island. Independentists like Martinican scholar and writer Raphael Confiant, which is where this quote is from, holds this decision in contempt. Following Frantz Fanon, he calls this psychological burden of being French on a Caribbean island, quote, schizophrenic, explaining that while many Martinicans believe in Black power, they reject the desire for independence. A question often asked is, à quoi sert l'indépendance? What's the point of independence? Confiant uses this disaster event, the hurricane, to demonstrate the effects of assimilation for Martinicans and their self-conception. So in the interest of time, I won't read the quote, but essentially he talks about how in independent islands, folks operate in community to help clean up after a hurricane, whereas in Martinique, he saw people playing tennis, he thought they were tourists and they were actually Martinicans. And for him, that's the mentality that's occasioned by assimilation. The French army is always going to help, and so they don't need to do anything. For Confiant, assimilation has resulted in an identity that alienates Martinicans from the wider Caribbean. To be in solidarity with the region, the island must cast off France's golden handcuffs. Official discourse related to volcanic activity supports Confiant's assertions. On April 12, 2021, just a few days after La Soufrière began erupting in St. Vincent, the France-Antilles published an article titled, "And if Pelée starts erupting, will we be ready?" In the article, the journalist speaks to state officials and scientists, as well as local residents, to gauge their concerns about an eruption. The first question addressed by the mayor of St. Pierre, the town in the foothills of the volcano, is whether he was worried by the current events in St. Vincent. Absolutely not, he says, because all scientists testify that there is no relationship or connection between the volcanoes of the Caribbean. The proof, there have been several eruptions of the St. Vincent volcano, and only once, in 1902, was there a concomitant eruption of Mount Pelée, chance and pure coincidence. There is a continentalist imaginary built into these scientific claims, that each volcano and each island is separate. But the officials, I would say, doth protest too much. portraying that there is a structure of feeling in Martinique about the Caribbean being a connected sea of islands. The Franc-Senti aims to further rupture this felt connection between the islands by appealing to nationalism. They juxtapose comments from two residents of St. Pierre, one a Haitian woman living in Martinique, and the other a Martinican born and raised in St. Pierre. While the woman talks about her concerns about what might happen and evokes the nightmares that her children were having, the Pierrotin, the guy from St. Pierre, says that it's only foreigners who are scared. In official discourse, real Martinicans then are not worried about what will happen because the French state will take care of them. In unofficial discourse, at least when it comes to the volcanic activity, Martinicans demonstrate their understanding of how the calculus of disaster will come to bear on their experience of what St. Vincent underwent. I examined the Facebook comments under this article. They had about 80 comments and 65 shares on the official page, which is a lot for Martinique. There are certainly those who believe in the value of being a part of France and who are concerned about the risks of independence in the face of environmental catastrophe. There are others who, contrary to Raphael Confiant's conclusions, very much feel themselves in relation to St. Vincent and other islands, many stating that Martinicans should not fool themselves into believing that the state and local politicians have their best interests at heart. While there were no casualties in St. Vincent, there have been long-term effects, including the ash from the volcano affected crops, livestock, and the water supply. On Facebook, commenters suggest preparing for this eventuality. So again, won't read this whole quote, but this one commenter, Aileen, who identifies as Martinican, she talks about how, what are we going to do when our turn arrives tomorrow or later? She talks about all of the different kinds of minor disasters. That's what I'm conceptualizing it as, how those are affecting the island, and yet people are not really doing anything to prepare. For Aileen, there is an expectation that the volcano will erupt. This emerges not from what scientists and politicians tell her, but the culmination of accretions of the past and the present, and a collective memory that includes her relation to other volcanic islands. While hurricanes are perhaps less troubling for Martinicans' feelings of safety and security, by attending to the expectation and anticipation of a volcanic eruption, we can feel the gentle rumblings of a Caribbean tectonic relationality. Now I'm just wrapping up. The day I left Martinique at the end of my fieldwork period, my plane flew along the northeast side of the island. It was the first time in 10 months that I was able to see the top of Mount Pelée clearly. Typically covered by clouds, I could see its foliage, calderas, grooves, and dips carved by the folding, faulting, and erosion of the Earth's oceanic plates and layered with hardened ash and solidified lava. There was not a cloud in the sky, and yet a palpable threat was looming over the island. Is it due for an eruption? Will we be ready when it does? In this paper, I was thinking with Hortense Spiller's move to read the oceanic literally and structurally. I suggest that we draw our attention to the tectonic and the volcanic, these palimpsests of geography that connect islands and transcends time and space. While the oceanic undid differentiation and enforced separation, with my work, I want to ask that we think about how we as Black people put ourselves back together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alyssa. It was such a wonderful opportunity to get to be and just intellectually engage with your work. So my name is Natara. I am a senior at Stanford University. I am a comparative literature student, and my current research exists at the intersection between critical Black theory, political theology, literature, and continental philosophy. It is my dearest pleasure to get to introduce the wonderful Rebecca A. Wilcox, who is a fourth-year PhD candidate at Princeton Theological Seminary. She is concentrating in religion and society, and her research engages Black religion, hauntology, and critical Black studies to explore the anti-Black antagonisms between life and death. Wilcox is from the Bronx, New York, where she was raised by her mother and siblings who serve as the heart and pulse for her commitment to critical Black thought.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I actually am going to share my screen. I don't have like a pretty presentation like the rest of you. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with like PowerPoints and stuff, but I want you all to be able to see the quotes that I will be working with. Let me make sure y'all can see it. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it now.
Wonderful. Okay. Let me go back. Okay, yeah, so these are the two quotes that I'm going to open up with, and I just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Darion, for the invitation. This will be my first time probably publicly defending James Cone. So we'll see how that goes. So I open up with these two quotes. The first one, Black theology exceptionally circumscribes the meaning of symbolic Blackness in terms of Black oppression and suffering. In Black theology, Blackness has become a totality of meaning. It cannot point to any transcendent meaning beyond itself, end quote. Victor Anderson. Second quote, Blackness is an ontological symbol. James Cone. I open with the above excerpts to represent an unresolved tension between Black theology and Black religion concerning the issue of Blackness as it relates to questions of life and meaning. Black theology is concerned with interrogating Black life through the centrality of Christian dogma, theological questions, and cultural organizations such as the Black Church, while Black religion relies upon secular formations of Black experiences not reducible to Christianity and the Black Church. Black religion's critical edge emerges from a defense against the Black theological tradition, which is accused of reducing Black religious experiences to racial essentialisms and matters of suffering. The goal of Black religion is to point toward life-affirming modalities where, as religious scholar Victor Anderson argues, quote, Black experience can transcend Blackness, end quote. The goal of my argument is to demonstrate how Black religion and Black theology may disagree on religious means, Christianity versus secularism, but not on what Charles Long defines as ultimate orientation. Both Black theology and Black religion are ultimately concerned with matters of transcendence that measure Black life according to that which overcomes the death-dealing realities of Blackness. Death cannot have the final say. The attempt to move Blackness away from death is understood as resistance to anti-Blackness. However, inherent to this resistance is a consensus amongst Black theological and Black religious scholars that there is a Blackness, the Blackness overdetermined by death, that we ought to reject. Here is what I argue to be the anti-Blackness of Black religion's anti-death orientation. To demonstrate my argument, I turn to the works of James Cone and Victor Anderson to flesh out this antagonism. In his earliest text, James Cone, founder of Black liberation theology, made an unsettling claim that still disturbs the field of Black religious scholarship. Blackness is an ontological symbol. Cone's assertion relies on an attempt to merge two distinct theological positions into one, that of Karl Barth and Paul Tillich, in order to reconcile the question of Blackness to God's incarnate revelation. Karl Barth's theology is concerned with revelation as event, whereby God is wholly revealed in Jesus Christ. However, for Barth, this revelation is an event that only happens in what Van Til names as Geschichte, or God's time, not historical time, thereby constituting a fundamental separation in Barth's theology between God and world. God remains wholly hidden in historical time, which is to say, in the world, and God's revelation through Jesus Christ is for God's own identification with humanity, not humanity's identification with God. The event of revelation in Jesus Christ is a wholly other realm. For context, Barth maintains this hardline distinction between God and the world to protest how God is used as justification in worldly affairs, such as World War I, throughout Catholicism, Protestant theology, and liberal theology. Cone agrees with Barth's interpretation of God's revelation in Jesus Christ, but rejects that this revelation is not also made apparent in historical time. Cone argues that God's revelation in Jesus Christ is an intentional identification with the oppressed in the world because the humanity of Christ is represented as a poor man lynched by the state. And this is also corroborated by womanist theologies who asks, was there any other way for God to redeem the sins of the world besides killing a Black woman's child? And those formations come by Dr. Stacey Floyd Thomas. This is Cone's turn to Paul Tillich's theology of the, quote, symbolic nature of all theological speech, end quote. Cone states, quote, "We cannot describe God directly. We must use symbols that point to dimensions of reality that cannot be spoken of literally. Therefore, to speak of Black theology is to speak with a Tillichian understanding of symbol in mind. The focus on Blackness does not mean that only Blacks suffer as victims in a racist society, but that Blackness is an ontological symbol and a visible reality which best describes what oppression means in America," end quote. To put succinctly, Blackness represents, in historical time, how God reveals himself to humanity as the ultimate symbol of suffering. This becomes the point of contestation for Black religion. Victor Anderson and a variety of Black religious scholars to follow reject Cone's formulation of Blackness as an ontological symbol, which could also be understood more properly as what David Marriott defines as the NEPA of Blackness. Ontological Blackness is a totalizing discourse that tethers Blackness to death and suffering and forecloses possibilities of transcendence within Black experiences. Now, transcendence is an important religious category for Anderson, as it represents something about individual and cultural fulfillment. Anderson utilizes transcendence similarly to the Kantian formation of the transcendental, which is distinct from Kant's understanding of transcendence as things beyond the bounds of reason and epistemology. Anderson, as a pragmatic naturalist, is not concerned with, quote, matters of the unknowable, end quote, rather, quote, human experiences that relate to larger expansive wholes, end quote, which is to say, Anderson understands that to think of Blackness as ontology is to contend with Western languages around the nature of things, a metaphysics that demands that the structure of life and death be mirrored through structures of Black and white. But if what is at stake for Black religion is some kind of subjectivity for Black experiences, then it has to disavow metaphysics and look toward pragmatic accounts of how individuals navigate the everyday and transcend the boundaries in front of them. Anderson's conception of transcendence is also informed by sociologist Alfred Schutz's conceptions of transcendence within the life world. Transcendence is not an worldly matter for Schutz, but an indication of a crossable boundary within the life world. The life world for Schutz is, quote, the experience of everyday life essentially as the province of human practice, end quote. However, the ultimate boundary for Schutz is death, since it cannot guarantee transcendence and therefore remains outside of the life world. What my argument is concerned with is how death remains the source of anxiety for the world, and the obsession with conquering death, the obsession with transcendence, is constantly worked out onto the individuals who are forced to bear death's mark in the world. Therefore, there can be no distinction between the ontological realities of Blackness and the everyday. If, as Victor Anderson argues, transcendence is the possibility to overcome the boundaries constituted by fixed and limiting Black ontologies, then what must be accounted for is what Axel Carrera expresses as, quote, ontologies' retaliatory effects on Blackness's para-ontological or transcendent disobedience, end quote. To put differently, it is because Blackness is in the world, but not of it, that the world retaliates against Blackness. Considering that we can never evade the entanglements of Blackness and death, Anderson turns toward a concept of grotesqueries, which seeks to capture how Blackness ebbs and flows through what could be understood through Saidiya Hartman's notions of insufferable pleasures, where suffering and pleasure cannot be rendered distinct. For Anderson, the grotesque acknowledges suffering, but emphasizes the ways Blackness plays in the dark, and that's a riff off of Toni Morrison. Anderson's concept of the grotesque seeks to function as the complexity and expansiveness of Blackness that produces ongoing possibility, or what Anderson terms as creative exchange. But as Patrice Douglas argues, quote, Blackness is already conditioned by accumulation and fungibility. It is held captive to innumerable terms of subjection, and those terms may not always appear as abjection, end quote. So if the grotesque relies upon a non-resolution of suffering and pleasure to ensure the ongoing reproduction of life and possibility, then Blackness remains a site of endless masochism where violence is without measure. This is what Zakiya Jackson defines as plasticity of Blackness, quote, where Blackness is experimented with where Blackness is experimented with as the infinitely malleable lexical and biological matter, such that Blackness is a form where form shall not hold, potentially everything and nothing at the register of ontology. And that last part is also a Patrice Douglas reference. So then why is the grotesque the good news? What does it mean that the Black religious desire to transcend is so incessant that it would rather play in the endless reproduction of Blackness before it courts its own ontological yearning, as Calvin Warren describes, of a Black religious life? Has the anti-death sentiment in Black religion become so potent that it rejects its ancestral decree that before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave? And if so, does that not also make the promise of human flourishing, which is what Black religion is concerned with, totalizing? If Anderson rejects the ways Black ontologies essentialize Blackness's relation to death and suffering, is not the matter of transcendence a totalizing movement toward human life? So much so that it will call for an endless masochism where suffering and pleasure remain unresolved before it just called for an end. This leads us to interrogate if the critique of totalizations launched by Black religion is actually a critique of totalizations or a critique of Blackness. To put differently, it is not the categories of Western metaphysics that Black religion rejects, after all, considering that the human life is a modern category. It is the specificity of Blackness and its relation to death and niggerness that is being rejected, and in this rejection, simultaneously reproducing an anti-Black anxiety. How does this rejection of the Blackness Western metaphysics created not already concede to the anti-Black logics of metaphysics, which demands resentment toward Blackness as death? So in conclusion, if Black religious discourse attempted to read the ontological assertions within Black theology a bit more generously, then it might consider that what is at stake for Cone's singularity of the Black experience is not that the cross of Jesus Christ is an adequate analogy to Black suffering, or that Black ontologies offer no possibility of transcendence. Rather, death, and therefore Blackness, is the condition of possibility for both life and transcendence. The weight of this realization will make any serious political theology that seeks to give an account of God's activity in the world to rise to the occasion of demanding from the world what only a God can do. As Joy James states, quote, if the state seeks to act like a God and take life, then it should function as a God and resurrect life. If it cannot, then it is not a God, and its laws are not legitimate when they are predatory, end quote. But if the field continues to reject theorizing Black death as the condition for the world's possibility, then we will remain trapped on an auction block where the discursive material is always looking for the living amongst the dead. Perhaps it is on these grounds that I think the field should shift toward the call raised by Dr. J. Cameron Carter, who has invited us to a Black study of religion, where Blackness engages the imminent critique of the anti-Black libidinal economy of thought. Thank you.
All right, so thank you everyone for being so generous with your brilliance and your presentations. I know that there's a lot for everyone to be able to process and to be able to take in. And so I want to invite everyone, before I introduce our moderator, to begin to think of some of the questions that you all may want to ask in the Q&A. Again, you can add that either to the webinar chat or to the Q&A function, and between Dr. Robinson and myself, we will field some of those questions. And so I want to introduce Dr. Aileen K. Robinson, who's a historian of performance and technology with specializations in 18th and 19th British theater and Black cultural performances. Working across the history of science, technology, and theater, Dr. Robinson explores how systems of knowledge connected to the body and the object overlapped to produce practices of research, dissemination, and valuation. She teaches across the history of science and performance, magic and technology, 18th and 19th century stagecraft, and 19th and 20th century Black artistic production. So without further ado, Dr. Robinson.
Hello, and thank you all so very much for your wonderful work, your wonderful thinking, and for probing us, or for bringing us into a moment where we can really kind of think towards the future. I want to offer a few thoughts and then really open it up, because I think we are going to have a really fabulous conversation, and I cannot wait. I cannot wait. So I was meditating on the ways in which we are being grounded consistently through the different types of spatial, tectonic, and ontological concepts that you are all wrestling and thinking with. I'm thinking about the kinds of spaces like the staircase, in which we find support outside of the view, and where also, even in the view, resistance is made possible. I'm thinking of the ways in which that which becomes most lauded, most celebrated in our ways of thinking, the space race, becomes itself refused for an important and vital thriving of a very present, very important people. I love the ways in which we are encouraged through your work to think differently, to look differently around the corner, down the hallway, outside the frame of the camera, to think about the modes and codes of activism, of resistance, and of a different type of placemaking that reestablishes and reimagines the ways in which we can hold and persist in space. I'm thinking about the ways in which, once again, the doubling of space and space becomes a really important way for us to reimagine the ways in which an island, so networked into colonialism, helps us reimagine and rethink not only locally, but also globally, about the ways in which we can reclaim and reconceive of what it means to both belong and to self-identify. When we think about the ways in which the way our world is being made and unmade, how we can participate in its remaking. I'm also struck with the ways that we must constantly wrestle with the life worlds that we are engaged in, and thinking about the ways in which we consider how we can define and enter into a definition of Blackness that can allow for thrivance. I'm thinking here about the very important reckoning with, and the willingness to reckon, again, another border drawing, right? With these questions of death, and these questions of a bold and conscious and life-giving reckoning with the meaning of what that looks like. Well, we've looked at so many different methodologies and practices and individuals that anchor us into the extreme breadth and beautiful variation of thinking and living and thriving in this Black diasporic world. I am reminded that we constantly have these very wonderful juxtapositions and overlaps that we can consider that help us open up and reimagine, rethink, relook, right? Once again, at those things that give us tools. I'm also thinking too about the ways in which justice echoes through, right? It echoes through all of our work in very different ways, from the very local, in terms of someone, a student finding justice for themselves, a community finding justice in action, a nation finding justice in a reimagination, and us as Black folk thinking about what does it mean to find justice in belief and to resist that when we find its limits, and then to find joy and meaning in the kind of methodological and the theoretical reimagining of how we can engage. And I see you all doing that in really interesting, complex, and challenging ways. And I thank you all for the ways in which you've offered not only deep engagements with your subjects and your theories, but also the ways in which you're suggesting to us new ways, not only of doing our work, but of discipline making. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for what you're doing now and what you will be doing with all of your work. I'd love us to open, I ended on discipline making because I want to think about discipline making with you all, because that's something I think many of you are doing across the work. And there's obviously many more things, as I probably alluded to, that I'm really excited to talk about, but I want to start with that. So how do you imagine the discipline of Black Studies, and how would you, I both want you to think about, you've gestured to how you situate yourselves a little bit, each of you in some ways, but I wonder, what are some other ways in which you both situate yourself and also reimagine where you'd like to situate yourself? That makes sense. Wherever that kind of opens up an avenue for inquiry, please, I welcome you into this space.
I will jump in.
Yeah.
I will jump in here.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with how do you imagine the discipline of Black Studies? And I know that one of the questions that we had earlier was about its undisciplining. How do we undiscipline? And so one of the things that I was thinking about is, in what ways has Black Studies actually rejected a disciplining? I mean, there were 4 talks here. All of them were so different. None of us come from the same department, if we want to use that as an index for, a discipline. So I found that really interesting, to think about that rejection of disciplining, and how that doesn't really how undisciplining kind of sits on the spectrum of disciplining. And so how can we kind of think outside of that framework broadly? For myself, where I situate myself within Black Studies, I kind of think through 2 main questions. One of the questions is, what are the limits and possibilities of Black futurity when the colonial past must necessarily be built into visions of the future? And so I think about that because when I learned about the coffee project that I did my research on, I said, why valorize this colonial commodity, this plant that was transplanted to the Caribbean? And why bring that into one's imagination of what a more autonomous, independent future could look like? Mm-hmm. And then the other question that I think about is, how do we free ourselves from the past that is not past? And that's, coming out of Edouard Glissant and Christina Sharp's work. And so through those questions, my work engages with these questions of temporality, and in the interconnected kind of Black studies and Caribbean studies traditions. I think through environmental afterlives of slavery and the plantation, as well as political sovereignty. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I can thank you so much, Alyssa, for starting us off. I think for me, even getting this invitation into this space, I think oftentimes we don't really see education scholars in Black studies spaces. And so while I know that a lot of folks in education are doing that sort of work, it doesn't always feel like Black studies claims us. And so that's why I felt so really great to kind of be invited to share my work on this sort of platform and this sort of space. And so thinking about, you know, the undisciplined, wanting to see more folks who are doing that incorporating of education and Black studies. And so where I kind of situate myself, and I think this is why Black geographies has been so important to me, is that like when I look at how education as a field has sort of taken up Black students, it's always a focus on the violence, right? And the gratuitous violence that they face and the remarkable and even the mundane violence that they face. And for me, you know, using a Black studies lens, like if that is not the starting point or central point to the way that I want to understand how Black girls schooling, right? And so thinking about Black geographies and McKittrick's work and Winter's work, and thinking about what does that then mean if we don't center that, but then think about that as a reality that then Black folks then build on and navigate in and outside, inside and outside of, then it just allows me to think, to then center what Black girls are actually saying about their work and how they're thinking alongside violence. But that is not, like when I'm with these girls every day, the violence that they face is just there, but it is not central to who they are and how they even see themselves, even though that might be central to how others see them. So I think that is what Black Studies has truly offered me, and thinking about how I position myself within this sort of space.
Thank you.
I can jump in and say that I think one of my favorite things about Black Studies is that it has the capacity to hold so many conversations at once. Like all four of these conversations were so different and yet so necessary. And there aren't many disciplines that have the ability to hold that space. And I think that's because Black Studies takes as central concepts of racial capitalism and the fact that the Black body has been used to create the world as we know it today, and often isn't included in that world. I think when I think of like the future of Black study and in terms of what I also wanted to say another through line that we all have in our conversations today is that, and which I think is part of Black studies in general, is to be critical of institutional narratives and to be critical of institutional power. What we're doing is not like what I've heard recently described as pretty history, which is just recording what happened and making it sound nice. This is a very critical approach to power that is a shared narrative between all of us. And what I think when I look towards the future of Black studies and what I feel I'm learning from my predecessors and mentors is that Black studies comes from a place of not only educating ourselves, but educating our community and being accountable to educating our community. And I think maybe one of my biggest concerns about the future of Black study is sort of like an echo of Barbara Christian's, but what do we think we're doing anyway? To not get stuck in the theory that is theory for theory's sake so that we get tenure jobs and get to remain in the academy, but making sure that our work is accessible outside. I think that's why educational scholars are so important, because by necessity, your work is outside of the academy. And I think everyone here spoke to that as well. And so, yeah, that's going to be my little contribution to this. It's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everyone really covered it, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But what I will say is that I don't think of the future of Black studies because I don't think of the future of the academy. So I understand those two questions to be like inextricably linked. But I also want to say that I'm less interested in a Black studies and more interested in a Black question, and what that Black question for me has to contend with. It's how, to what a lot of Adriana said, the world is anti-Black, right? And the very world that we are engaging in many ways is predicated upon Blackness as the foreclosure of all of the conversations of futurity and all the conversations of possibility, right? Like Blackness becomes the launching pin for those things. And so I'm interested in a Black questioning that stays with the wretchedness of Blackness. I think a lot of times that when we're talking about Blackness, we're talking about it from a place of trying to reclaim it from this kind of stereotypical understanding of Blackness as objection. But I think there's something generative rather that we can do in a kind of Black study if we stay in this line of questioning of Blackness as this wretchedness to track what kind of anxieties it causes in the fields that we're engaging, such as geography, education, religion, and so forth. So.
Wonderful. It prompts me to another query, which I would love to, take this in whatever direction it feels productive for you all, which is about method. Because method, right, we use these terms of method, right, of these kind of structural terms, right, to think about both how we kind of engage and understand and craft our projects, right? And I wonder if you might meditate a bit on how you unthink, respond to these kinds of questions of method in your projects. And maybe also the other side note to this is about what has surprised you, right? What has surprised you and helped you push your own work in the direction you want to go? Yeah. So wherever in that question you find an anchor point, I welcome.
Okay, I'll be brave first this time. When I think what surprised me most about my own methodologies is that while I feel like my work itself is so interdisciplinary and wide-ranging, I feel like it's been actually very important and helpful for me to like zoom in and sort of like learn very specific methods and then move between them with a dexterity. Things like, even archival research and learning how to write history, and then also how to critique that writing of history. But literary analysis, looking at methodologies of like visual culture and visual analysis, like going to different categories of methods and learning them has helped me feel very tethered in a project that can sometimes feel very expansive. I think when it comes to doing our work and thinking about Blackness, I think Cedric Robinson says that Black Studies is a critique of the West as we know it, and that's a really big project. And so for me, having discrete methods has been really helpful. And then I think underlying all my work is prioritizing Black feminist theory. And for that, I think I've come to understand that Black feminist theory for me is any theorist or any theory that takes as central the Black woman as the most dispossessed character in modernity. And if you move from that place, any work that you do, if you start from and include the Black woman as like sort of the forward momentum of your study, it's going to be a critique of racial capitalism as we know it. And I think a lot of work that sort of like does a little bit of a capitalist critique but doesn't fully succeed is one that doesn't take gender and sexuality into account at the same time. And so starting there and looking at thinkers like Winter, Spillers, Hill Collins, McKittrick, Hartman, Eula Taylor, Marissa Fuentes, Cheryl L. Harris, Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison, Barbara Christian, like the list is so long. There's so many people who are thinking from that position, which also helps me ground myself theoretically.
Aaliyah, yeah, you want to?
Sure. Well, I wanted to thank you all for your presentations, for your time. We're in different time zones. And speaking of time, I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit, like the words I wrote down as you all were talking were Blackness, temporality, space. I often think Black studies is a space where, as a historian, oftentimes I try to put events or things together that maybe people who are professors or advising me don't necessarily think that they fit. My main issue is, well, what's your time frame here? Because you're jumping from here to here. I'm not getting it. And I think all your projects are really good examples of how what Black studies can do for our considerations of time and space as it relates to the Black experience, whether they be Black girls, whether they be people in Martinique's conception of a, an understanding of the mountain as it relates to these things, and so on and so on, and maybe expanding that for Rebecca's talk to think about religion as a space and theology as a space. So any thoughts from you guys on Blackness, temporality, and space, and what are you guys challenging as it relates to those things? What are your interventions? How are you using it? Speak to any, all, or none of it, depending on what you like, but I appreciate your presentation so much.
Yeah, I think I can jump in here because I'm still thinking, I think these questions, the previous question and this question are both kind of related. And so what it's making me think of is this idea of mapping as a method. And that was really, when I was designing this project, that was really, really important to me, to try and figure out what are the different ways that we can work towards mapping Black girls, Black West Indian girls' experiences in school. And so then for me, the parts of the method that I have, particularly with mapping, are like the social network analysis, where girls are mapping what their support networks look like in schools. Then they take me on these walking interviews where I ask them to take me on a tour of their school and talk about the memories that they have in these various spaces. And then they do the focus groups, which are education journey mapping, which they map their journeys through schools, and through conversations with one another, sort of discuss the differences and similarities that they have. And so one thing I'm really thinking about when it comes to interventions is, what do we learn about education policy? What do we learn about school policy? What do we learn about schools as institutions when we think about the placemaking that Black girls bring to the table, right? And so in kind of considering all of the ways that Black girls are navigating these spaces, particularly given how, even when I entered into the school, one of the first things that the folks wanted to talk to me about was how Black girls were always fighting, right? But then if we look at how they're using space, that really hasn't come up as much, essential to their lived experiences within the school. And so mapping as a method, as a form of intervention in how we think about Black girls in school, and generally, and not just in schools, really wanting to think about how we think about Black girls largely. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for those questions. I think it helped me bring my many thoughts together. And something that I'm working on right now is my archival chapter. And as an anthropologist, we're not entirely trained on this. So, on my Twitter, I was talking about how it is kicking my ass, this archival chapter. Because one of the things that I want to do is look at the lived experience of these like secondary commodity plantation, like the plantation life on these secondary commodity plantations. And so a place that I see my work building or intervening in is that I think that in Black studies, we could stand to be more capacious about the plantation histories that we theorize from. I think there's definitely an Anglophone, USian, British Caribbean bias or dominance when we're thinking about afterlives and plantation histories. And so even when we're drawing on the work of, say, Edouard Glissant, who's French Caribbean, we're looking at his poetics of landscape rather than theorizing from that experience of the plantation in the French Caribbean. Of course, there's a lot of work on the Code Noir, but I think that becomes rendered in this particular way where it's like, oh, this was a humane kind of enslavement, or more humane than other places. And I think that has its own problem. So I'm trying to track that experience in order to make that kind of contribution there, to think about what can we learn from that, and what can we theorize from the experience on these what were much smaller plantations than in the US or in Jamaica.
yes, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alyssa. Any other thoughts on these questions?
I do want to jump in for a second on this question because I think it's super important and especially frustrating when it comes to like writing histories, when you're always asked like, well, what's your time frame? What 64 unique distinct years are you looking at? And I think something that my project kind of almost overconfidently assumes is that like we usually think of this, the space race is supposed to be from the launch of Sputnik in 1954 to the landing of man on the moon in 1969. That's the space race. But I feel like it's very fair to say that 1492 was the start of the space race in terms of racing around the world, racing around, trying to claim space as our own. And so I actually think 1969 is the end of a long moment. The planting a flag on the final frontier, claiming the moon, is the end of the project that Columbus started in 1492. And I think part of what my work does is expresses I have a frustration. I try not to let it out in my work, but I have a frustration with how like myopic like academia can be when it's like somehow imagines that the 21st century is so far and so different from the 20th. Like I think if we were to zoom out, like I think it's completely fine to look at 500 plus years of time as a shared moment. And so I think that's one of the ways that my work has approached time. And it's also one of the things I've already gotten pushback about because historians do really want you to have like discrete years. And some of them don't like when you say 1492 to 1969 is your time frame, but I'm gonna stand by it.
I love that. Keep that, because I didn't mean to follow up, but I think that unless we are allowed the space, whether it be in Black studies or history or whatever our disciplines are, and that's what Black studies does, to change the framings of times, then the narrative will stay the same, right? So just the way you broke that down really opened it up so that it can be inclusive of the Black experience in a way that can account for these afterlives. So I think that's really brilliant, and I appreciate all your answers. And I'll leave it at that because, I could keep going, but thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And yes, thank you so much. Yeah, much to think about there. Yeah, absolutely. I have so there's two questions in the chat and I'll read those out so that we can get going. And one of them is for Rebecca. Thank you so much. Given that death is often considered a human universal, by which I mean the human is a being towards death, so to speak. Can you speak to how or if the category of death is racially distributed differently? Does the endless masochism of Blackness, as you put it, as I remember correctly, suggest a racialized relationship between will/agency and death/dying? And I can also drop this for you.
So I'm going to try to follow the question. I think if I understand the question, if it's asking what kind of like racializing work does the terms of life and death do, I think that's what, okay, let me read it.
Yeah, I thought I'd drop it.
Yeah, so what I don't want to suggest is that death is generative in the sense of like, death is a solution or death is an answer for the question of whatever, right? Although I am interested in how people are contending with death because we have like, these African cosmologies who don't believe that death is an end, right? And so a lot of times when we're talking about the way that I'm understanding death in particular is a kind of limit, right? The limit by which the life world, this is kind of what I was trying, this is the reason why I situated the paper within the conversations of the transcendental is because there's kind of a philosophical move there that there's nothing outside of epistemology, right? And so in that kind of grand scheme of things, I think that conversations about death are always conversations about boundaries. And I think that when we're talking about the way that race, or that Blackness in particular, configures this space of death. We're talking about, as Anthony Farley says, like, the world fears death and the slave is the body by which the world works out that fear, right? And I think that's, we're trying to track a line of anxiety or abjection that the kind of work that death does in the global imaginary, or the kind of work that death does in kind of like discursive arguments regarding this kind of linearity of movement toward conversations of life or transcendence, right? And so the boundary for that, the condition of possibility for that, for me, is always going to be that which is a foreclosure, and that those are the registers by which I want to think of death. But I also want to say that, like, to that point, and this might go to the conversations that we were having about time, the categories of life and death, when it comes down to talking about Blackness, are already conflated, right? There's no way by which we can distinctively determine by which one lives and dies when, and I'm thinking more so with Stephanie Smallwood, when she defines social death as the means by which we can discipline the body without extinguishing the life within, right? And so what we would have to contend with is if Blackness can even reflexively render distinct, rather, a moment in history or a moment in time where Blackness did not configure as it is in the global imaginary. And I think a lot of times what we want to say is that, oh, that starts with modernity, or that starts with the antebellum period. And I think the problem with these kind of temporal notions of how we're thinking about life and death is that, in a Derridian sense, time is out of joint. And I think what is meant by that is that we're not actually dealing with a kind of temporal register of an end, which is what we want to believe the anxiety of death is about. Then what we really want to deal with is a foreclosure, right? And so it's not about the human being toward death, more it's about the impossibility of being human. And I think that's the register by which I want to think Blackness, that if the human is the one that gets to have a temporal understanding of by which they lived and died, right, can actually render distinct in time where their identity or where their positionality becomes legible to the global world, then I want to think of Blackness as that foreclosure by which you can't even get into a conversation about temporality or a conversation about death if you can't get into a conversation about Blackness's relationship to ontology. I hope that made sense.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So Natara, since you have a follow-up, please.
Yeah, no, I do have a follow-up, but I also don't want to take away time for the person that I know asked a question before me.
Well, yeah. So why don't you pose your follow-up?
Okay.
And then maybe
okay.
and then I'll ask the final question for our session today.
Of course. Yeah, no, I really loved your answer to that. I suppose I think trying to contend with sort of Marriott's, essay on revolutionary suicide, and how we have sort of this phenomenon where, the Black, cannot embody the martyr, because I think, as you're saying earlier, it holds this really unwieldy implication that Black death can be generative, or that Black death in some way can, strive towards a reclaiming of agency, which I think you're gesturing to as being impossible. And so I think for me, like, going back to the question of discipline, I think what's so fascinating about your research is where theology emerges, because I know in another talk you talked about how being anti-death is sort of being anti-God's promises. And so I'm just so curious to know here, like, how theology emerges between these questions, because we're sort of sitting within this aporia, like within this paradox, in the sense that, we cannot will death in the sense of death being this generative end, or death being this meaningful finality. But on the other hand, to avoid death, to be anti-death, is, I think, according to your view, like, anti-theology, and I think exists outside of the bounds of a Christian theological capture. And so I feel like I'm just really curious to know how you hold these two things together.
No, I love that. I was laughing with one of my friends earlier because I was like, I think I'm a little bit of a Bardian. And what I mean by that is I opened up my paper because Bart makes an interesting move in the conversation of theology as it relates to time, right? So this question that it's kind of like liberal theology is trying to give it also like an empirical grounding for why one would ask theological questions, right? And philosophy is very much so, I mean, in the Kantian sense, like if we're going to hold space for the noumena, nothing can be said about it, right? So this whole conversation about the holy other or that which is outside of the boundaries of reason and epistemology and history is not something that we can engage. What I found to be interesting about Bart is that all we need is the possibility of the desire for the event for us to say that it happened, right? And so Bart is saying that it doesn't actually matter if Jesus or the event of God as incarnate happens in historical time. All that matters is this possibility, right? And so he's not concerned with Jesus, the history of Jesus. He's concerned with the person of Jesus. But then he makes this move to say this event doesn't even happen in history. It doesn't happen in the world's time, right? It happens in God's time. And God's time is something that is a foreclosure for the world, right? And so I'm just kind of like, well, yeah, like you can't be in the world. You have to, like, there's this possibility, this condition of possibility by which this event, right? God can reveal God's self, the revelation as event can reveal God's self in time, but it doesn't happen in time because humanity or the world is already fallen, right? And so like this kind of like temporal kind of, I hope I'm answering your question, but I think theology for me is the attempt in many ways to transgress kind of what I think philosophy or empiricism in particular seeks to do ethically, which is to say, let's stick with reason in order to like really negotiate what we can and cannot interpret about experiences because of, the violence of theological interpretation. But theology is actually saying like, it doesn't actually need a material reality for it to be what's shaping the realities, right? All it needs is the possibility of the condition. All we need is the possibility that God can reveal God's self through flesh for that to be the miracle, right? And this is how you get a structure. This is how you get a world built around a Christian dogma that believes in the miracle of the resurrection, particularly because it's impossible. So it's the impossibility that has world-making capacity. It is in the temporal registers of what's outside of the conditions of what can be known that everyone is trying to create the world that they cannot know, right? So we would think of the historical world as a pursuit toward God's time, which is why the world looks a lot like our theological claims. And so I love that theology stays with the condition of possibility and this unknowability as this kind of specter, right? As this kind of ghost of like what may be animating all of your desires to be in the world. I hope that answered your question.
I think in many ways also, Rebecca, I think you're like in thinking through that, I really appreciate the way you're kind of demonstrating your methods, demonstrating the ways in which you move between the thinking, right? And the and when you said the kind of the revisiting too of certain thinkers in the work. So thank you. I want to just end on this last question for everyone. How do you think, and this is from one of our guests, how do you think how does your research, or however you imagine Black studies, can it be leveraged to activate Black imaginations around what it means or looks like to be Black and free? I'm also going to put that on our chat.
I want to say this briefly because I love this question, because I think a lot of the discourse right now has like thrown away the category of freedom. But Anthony Farley has a piece called Perfecting Slavery, and he says something like the Black can only be free. And I think that is such a wonderful line, because what I think he's trying to articulate is that it's actually ontology that's the capture, right? It is actually like the form, it is actually the language by which we can relate to one another, that's the capture, right? But to not be able to have form, not to be able to be captured by these ontological registers, which is what we're saying Blackness is, right? This inability to be in the world, or this inability to be human, or this inability in a Wintterian sense to represent the overrepresentation of man, these genres, right? This is something that Blackness constantly defies. Then Farley is saying, well, then the Black can only be free. That if we think of the capture as the ontology, then that might give us a different directional orientation toward the question of freedom.
Mm. Mm. Wonderful. Yeah, from my orientation, I think I would say it would be speculation. Speculation, and we can of course expand that out to speculative fiction. And I remember that tweet people have been talking about. It's 2024. It's the year Parable of the Sower started. So who knows what is coming, but something is coming. We're reaching another end, another unveiling. I think that we're coming towards that. And I think that Black Studies scholars and students are thinking about what the end will look like and how we'll practice reworlding in a way that is anti-capitalist, that's spiritually informed, that accounts for environmental, disability, and gender justice. And so I think to kind of refer back to my work, and this goes back to that question around temporality as well, is I think that Caribbean studies has often kind of conceptualized temporality as how the past constrains the present and the future. And what I'm trying to do with my work is look at what are the ends that we're striving for, and how does that change how we reinterpret or interpret the past. And so in that sense, when we're thinking about how my work and Black studies in general can kind of contribute to or help with our liberation, I want us to ask ourselves, what are the ends and the afters of the apocalypse, the end, the catastrophe? What are the ends that we're striving for? And what do we need from the past to get us there?
I think you said speculative fiction, which is my jam, so I'm gonna hop in there. There is a talk that Sadia Hartman and Fred Moten did at the University of North Carolina like years ago called The Black Outdoors. And in it, at one point, Hartman essentially says something like, because of the world that she's inhabited her whole life, she might not be the one who's capable of imagining the future of the future of the future, the future beyond the present moment. And so rather she's sort of working towards rather than assuming or trying to predict what could be. And that really resonated with me. I don't necessarily trust, my instincts. And I think there's like a way in which I probably will always initially move towards ideology without even realizing it. And even when it comes to Octavia Butler, she has 2 books that are focused on space travel. And one of them, the first series, Lilith's Brood, her character Lilith is also similarly faced with this, realizing that might not be a part of the future. She might not be able to conceptualize it, and yet she's responsible for making it possible. And so I think when I think of my work and I think of what it means for the Black imagination and for imaginations, period, I think my work is really just trying to get people to be careful about those imaginings and to sort of mistrust initial instincts, because I think even when we look at something like Afrofuturism, which is a beautiful aesthetic that is really specifically unique for its educational purposes, it really can draw people in, and yet a lot of times we see a lot of Afrofuturist art is very it steps into the neoliberal imaginary of like, okay, the future as we imagine it is fine as long as there are Black people in it. I don't agree with that. And I think my work is really just trying to get us to think about, when we imagine the future, can we just be careful about whose imaginary we're stepping into? Isaac Asimov, who is sort of like one of the many fathers of science fiction, he wrote I, Robot. He talks about 1945 as a really distinct moment in our global imaginary, because that was when the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. And ever since then, he says speculative fiction had to be accountable to technology and stop sort of imagining outside of like the realities of tech. And I would really love to see a change and the imagination going forward. And you already see that in Black speculative fiction of sort of stepping outside of the technology of the West as a way to imagine the future, and doing things that seem impossible. N.K. Jemisin is very good at this. A lot of her work is magic, but it's also technology. And so, yeah, I just want to, that's also, there's a quote from a very famous man who I can't remember, who says, like, the difference between technology and magic is indistinguishable. It's just knowing how things work. That causes the difference. And so I think if we like look towards our futures and sort of imagine whatever we want without having recourse to like the world as we know it, we could have a lot more joy and possibility in the future. Thanks. Sorry, that was a lot.
Yeah.
Excited.
Yeah, I think for me, and thinking a little bit about what you said, Adriana, about you've lived thus far, and so there's certain ways that you're already moving. And I think that's what makes me so excited about studying youth and Black girls in general, because there are ways that they question, right, everything that we take for granted or the ways that we're already socialized to be, right? And so in thinking about this question about Black and free, I think in my work, one of the contributions that my work makes or interventions that it makes is that like we're seeing Black girls practice freedom, right? Particularly in the way that they're refusing and the way that they are engaging in refusal. And now there are consequences to freedom, as we see for a lot of these girls. I didn't necessarily go into today, but there are a lot of consequences for practicing freedom through refusal, but they are actually engaging in that. And so sometimes when we think about futurity, it's like this thing that is coming. But I think a lot of times when we look at youth, Black girls, it is something that is now, right? And so I think that is something that is really powerful about the sort of work that I'm doing, is that we get to see, like, imagine the world differently by folks who are actively and steadfastly refusing the way that the world currently exists. So, yeah.
Thank you all so very much. That was absolutely fabulous and gives us so much to think through. I will pass it back to you, Darion. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all for joining us. We're going to bring our second annual Emerging Directions panel in Black Studies to a close. There are a couple of events that, if you're a Stanford student or affiliate, or even some folks that can join us on Zoom, the Black Studies Collectives will continue to host the graduate orientations to Black Studies. We have 2 more sessions on Black decolonial thought and applying Black Studies work to social sciences that'll be taking place on March 1st and March 15th. If you have the time, we would love to have you. And with that, I would just say thank you all once again, and we look forward to you all joining us next year.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you
all so much. Thank you for everything.
Thanks, everyone. That was wonderful.